Hello and welcome to this quick tutorial where we're going to show how to make an HTML canvas interactive by integrating it with standard HTML input elements. For this particular case, we have a Hermann Grid illusion set up. And as a refresher, if you watched the last video, and just as a quick walkthrough if you didn't, what we're doing is that we have a canvas here, and we're going to set up the Hermann Grid. And so what we're going to do is just loop through and do some math, and draw some simple squares on this canvas in rows and columns to make this grid. What I want to adjust for this is that if you look closely, you'll see that right now we use constants for both the gap and how big the squares are. So the squares are 70 by 70 pixels and the gaps are 12 pixels wide. What I want to do is add two inputs, one for adjusting the size of the squares and one for adjusting the size of the gaps. To begin, let's go to our index.html file. And here's our canvas right here, the Hermann Grid canvas. And what I want to do is add a div for the inputs container. And inside of it, the first thing I'm going to put is an input for the square dimension. And so right now, I'm going to set the default value to, I'll say 70 actually, because 70 was the default value that we had right here. And it has a min value of 1 and a max value of 100. So this will be 1 by 1 pixels, and this will be 100 by 100. And by default, it will be 70 pixels. And then an explanation of the HTML. The input will be of type range, that's why you can drag it back and forth. And then the ID will be square dimension, which we're going to use to grab a hold of it in the JavaScript. And then also for the label to know what it's a label for, so that when I hover over this label here, you'll see that there's a slight highlight in the range input part. The next thing we're going to add is another range input, and this one will be for the gap size, starting with a value of 12 and again going between 1 and 100 pixels. Right now, things are looking good, but let's style it a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do down here is going to be styling the inputs container. And what I'm going to do is display flex. And that's not going to do much right now, but it's going to open the door to do two things. The first thing I want to do is just adjust the gap, the horizontal gap between all of these, just to give everything a bit more space. And then the next thing I want to do is, if I stretch the page, right now everything is in the middle of the page, and I kind of want them to be pressed to the right. So what I'm going to do for that, let me keep this a bit wider. I'm going to say justify content flex end. And now we see that's not actually changing anything. And my suspicion for that is that right now, if I inspect, you'll see that the flex container is actually just as wide as all of these. Yep, so this here, if I stretch that a bit, is the inputs container. And as you can see, it's not actually taking up the entire width of the screen, or sorry, its container. It's just sizing itself based on the content inside of it, and nothing more. So what I'm going to do is just set the width of it to be 100%. And there we go. And just to show what I mean, I'll give it a background color of red. And as you can see, the background now spans the entire width of our container, in that everything is being justified to the end of it. And if I remove that, you'll see that it is in the middle. Or sorry, it's actually flex start as default, but we want it to be flex end. And then if I did get rid of the width of 100%, you will see that the width is just vacuumed right to it. So right now we want all of this except for the background color. There we go, looking good. And the last little thing I want to do for quality of life changes is that if you hover over the range input, you'll notice that you don't get the little clicky pointer cursor thing. So what I want to do is just make it do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all inputs that are of type equal to range. And that what I'm going to do there is just set the cursor to pointer. Hit prettier, and then now we have it where it does that. Cool. Now that things are looking good, I'm going to close this up and shrink the screen a bit just to give ourselves a bit more room for programming. We can close this, and now we want to go to the main. Now we have two more elements that we want to keep track of with our JavaScript logic. So right now we're just keeping track of the canvas, which is this guy right here, and we want to keep track of this one and that one. So what I'm going to do is say that we're going to have our square size input, and that's going to be equal to document.getElement by ID. And the ID of that one is square dimension. So I'll take that, put it right here. And then the next one we have is our gap size. So let me take that, call it gap size input, and get our ID from over here. Put that here and we're done. And right now that says HTML element or null. So I'm going to type it as HTML input element. And you know what? It's not the best lying to TypeScript, because in reality this really could be null. It would be better to do some error handling here. So say if no canvas or no square size input or no gap size input, let's just throw a new error and say could not find element. It's not the best error handling, but it's better than nothing, because right now what we have is that we're telling Canvas right now that this is guaranteed to be an HTML input, but it might actually not come up. Like if somebody later on says that they want to change this to be square dimension, it's going to error out, because if we look into the JavaScript in the console, it'll say could not find element. So now they'll have a better idea of what's going on rather than just kind of lying. And so now if I don't have that, comment that out, you'll see that, oops, and I gotta make this error out again. You'll see that it's not erroring out or anything, and that everything seems to be fine in the dev tool so far, but we might just run into mysterious bugs later. So I'm actually just gonna keep that as this. And be truthful here, saying that this could be a canvas element or null, and that this could be an HTML input element or null, and that this could be, in that this one also will be an HTML input element. Whoops, not there. As an HTML input element or null. Yep, like that. Oops, that should be as. There we go. And I should quickly mention that if you're following along in JavaScript, not TypeScript, you just don't need to worry about any of this, but I do suggest you do follow along in TypeScript, just because it makes your life way easier over time. And something I'm noticing is that we have a lot of repeated TypeScript code here, which is saying that it could be some sort of element that we say, which this one is a canvas element or null, or an HTML input element or null. So let me create a generic type right here just to clean things up. I'll call it nullable. And what it's going to do is, like a function, it will take in, like you know how a function can take in a thing here, we can take in a thing here, like so. But I'm just going to call it t for now, and that's going to be equal to t or null. And so now how we use it is this, is that we say that it will be a nullable HTML canvas element. So the type of that is going to be HTML canvas element or null. So if I just make that its own type here, and I'll just call it my thing, will be equal to nullable HTML canvas element. If I hover over this, it will say it's HTML canvas element or null. So using generic types like this just helps clean up your code base a little bit. So I'll make these two here nullable. So I'm going to hit Command D, delete it, nullable HTML input element, and there we go. And right now you can see nothing is erroring out because the canvas is just an HTML canvas element because of this check right here. Because without this, it would complain saying that the canvas could be null. Type null is not assignable to HTML canvas element because it can be of type canvas element or null. But now, if we make it past this, we know that it must not be null. Little TypeScript hiatus, but let's get back to the main program here. Right now what I want to do is create a config object, and what that's going to have on it is going to be the square size, and that will be, we'll think about that in a moment, I'll just put 5 for now, and then the gap size, and that will be 5 for now. I want the default value of it to be the, this should actually be beneath here. Okay. Now the default value of this for the square size should be the square size input dot value. And then this one should be the gap size input dot value. And so what that should be, if I console.log it, let's take a look. If I open this up, we'll see it's 12 and 70. The reason for that is because the gap size has a default value of 12 and this one has a default value of 70. But as you see right now, they're both strings and they should be numbers. So I'm going to just wrap both of those in a number. So I'm going to hold Alt to highlight this one as well. Hit the opening parentheses, go to the beginning, write number. And there we go. Now you can see that it's 12 and 70. Very cool. Next thing I want to do is add some event listeners. So I'm going to say the square size input dot add event listener. And what that's going to be is a change event. And that will give us an event. And then with that event, let's just console.log it for now. e.target.value. All right, let's see what happens with that. If I go to the console and I change it, 60, 85, but you'll notice it only happens when I release the mouse. So if I release it, it fires the event. I want it to be kind of smooth where as I change it, it will be able to dynamically adjust it. So for that, we actually want to use input instead. Now you'll see when I drag it, we get the whole range of everything. You will notice we have some TypeScript errors that e.target might be null. So first thing we could do for that is just say if no e.target, just return. And then we have one saying that value does not exist on event.target. The reason for that is that the knowledge that this is an HTML input element is not seeming to be transferred to the event here. So what we could just say is that we have our target here and say that it's equal to e.target as HTML input element. Just to remind TypeScript that we are indeed working with an HTML input element. And now instead of e.target, we're just going to work with that target here. And there we go, everything should be working. And then let's get our value the same way. So let me copy and paste this, delete this line, and then say const value is equal to target.value. And just to make sure, like last time, I want to make sure that this is a number. There we go. And so now with this, what I want to do is say that our config.squareSize is going to be equal to the value there. And that should update the square size in the config. And now the next thing that I want to do is pass it to the draw Hermann Grid function. So right now we have our setup Hermann Grid function, and what that does is it resizes the canvas and it draws the grid and then adds an event listener. I just want access to the draw grid function because that just straight up draws the grid. So let me import that in to here, draw grid, and I want to be able to call it like so, where I pass in the canvas and then I pass in the config. You'll notice that the config is erroring out because it's not accepting this type. So let me put that right here. So let's say that we have a config that is of type this, and I'm gonna hit the prettier button, square size and number. And just to make things a little cleaner, I'm gonna add an interface above, so I'll say interface grid config. And again, if you're not following along in TypeScript, this doesn't matter one bit, but again, it's always good to use TypeScript. So let me replace this here, grid config. Now it's a little easier. So now that we can see this is here, and let me actually make this optional. So now grid config can be there or not. You could call it just fine with the config and just fine without the config, but you can't put something else in like a 5 because it's going to say that number is not assignable to grid config. And again, that question mark right here just made it so that you don't have to pass it in, which means that the config here will be undefined in that case. But in this case, we do want it in. So I'll put that there. And now we have access to our config. And so what that has in it is the square size, so .square size and config.gap size. And we have those right here. So something that we can do is say that the square size should be equal to the config, and if we have it, the square size. And if we don't, it will be 70. So this is using some of that newfangled fancy JavaScript syntax. And what this is saying is that we're going to see right now our config is grid config or undefined. Without this question mark, we might, if this is undefined and it calls undefined.squareConfig, undefined.squareSize, everything explodes because you cannot reference a property of undefined. So what we're going to do here is say only try to access that if config exists. So this is kind of saying config, does it exist? If so, .squareside. Otherwise, if this doesn't exist, this will short circuit everything to be undefined, and it's not even going to check if the property exists on it. So at this stage, if it does short circuit and become undefined, what this operator is going to do is look at the thing before it and say, are you truthy? And undefined is not truthy, it's falsy. And if it is falsy, it's going to say, okay, let's just use the thing on the right, so it'll become 70. But then let's say that the config exists and the square size in it is, let's say, 80, so this becomes 80. This will look at it and say, is 80 falsy? No, it's not, it's truthy. So it's just going to use 80 and not bother with replacing it. So that's how that works. So let's give this one the same treatment over here. And this will be the gap size, or 12. And actually, now that I think about it, I think it might work. It's doing something. Oh, I think I know why. It's because in draw grid, what should happen here is that every time it draws the grid, it should be cleaning itself up. And to do that, it should be clearing the whole canvas. We're going to say context.clearRect, and what that's going to do is just clear the entire canvas, and it will clear it from starting in the top left corner all the way here, 0, 0, and then we're going to have it stretch and clear everything starting from here all the way to here, so pretty much the whole thing. So that will be the canvas.width and the canvas.height. There we go. That will just be our first thing, so that we're going to make sure we're going to clear everything, start with a blank slate, and then draw our grid. So right now, there we go. That's getting really small and really big. Cool. That appears to be working. So let's go take a look of how this is actually working. So we add an event listener to our square size input, which is this one right here, this range input, and as we drag it, it's going to fire off this callback function, which is going to receive an event, and the event.target should be the actual thing that we're touching here, and if it doesn't exist for some reason, we're just going to return, because I have no idea what's going on there, but that shouldn't happen. And then we're going to say, let's get our target, and the target we know is an HTML input element, and we know that has a value, so we're going to take the value from that and just make sure it's a number. And then we're going to change the config property for the square size to be the value that we pull from here. So here it will be 100. So the config is now going to have square size of 100. And then we pass that into the draw grid function. So the canvas and the config. And what that's going to do now is first it's going to clear everything to make sure that we're starting with a blank slate. And then it's going to try to grab the config values. And this time we are passing one in. And the value here will be 100. Right here. And then because 100 is truthy, we're not going to bother with that, and we're going to use 100. And same for that one because we're passing it in, but that is just going to be equal to 12 at the moment. And then we're just going to draw our entire grid, just as before. So let's apply this treatment to the gap size. So I'm going to say gap size input, and then all the same stuff, and then dot gap size. There we go, and that actually should just work like magic. So I'm increasing the gap, square size isn't changing, and there we go. So I'm going to increase the gap size to the max, just to show that it's still working, increase that, and as you see, it's maintaining the gap size, and if I make it super dense like that, you can see that, oh god, it's hard to look at, and there we go. The gap size is maintaining as well, because we're keeping that one reference to the config and just changing the property we need to when we change it, and it doesn't touch the other properties, so that if we change the gap size still is 100 right now, and when I change the square size, let's say square size is 1, so it's 1 and 100. If I change it to, let's say, 50 around, now the square size config is 50 because this changes it here, and the gap size is still 100. because we changed it beforehand, so now this will be 50 and 100. And that about wraps everything up. So right now if I make it a little bigger and I play around with it, you'll see that everything is working just fine. And we are not wrapped up because as you can see, hey, that kind of changed everything. Right now my gap size should be 100 and my square size should be 100 too, but when I resize the screen, it's changing it and it's ignoring what we put in here. And the reason for that is actually in the setup Hermann Grid function. So you'll see here, when we resize it, we're going to call the callback function withdraw grid, but it's not actually going to use the config. So inside the draw grid function, it's going to just use 70 instead, because right now this is undefined, it's not being passed in, and so it has no idea what the config object is that we used. Let's actually make this not optional. And here's why TypeScript is so great, because it makes it so easy to refactor. Now that I made it not optional, the things that are erroring out right now is this. So right now, I'm gonna have to add in the config here, which will be the, I think I called it a grid config, hit prettier. There we go. And now that can be passed in right here and here. And that will make that stop complaining. And now you'll see that main is complaining that in the setup Hermann Grid function, we're not adding the config. So we can add that right here, config. So now I can adjust the square size just as before. The default values are still working, because if I change the default value of the gap to, let's say, 82, and I refresh, yep, it's 82 each time. Let's keep it at 12. But yeah, now I can adjust this, and everything seems to be working. And then if I readjust it, it still is using those config values. And the reason it's using those config values is because whenever I resize it, it's using that config. So let me actually just play around with it a little more. There we go, because that config is getting passed in to the setup Hermann Grid function, which is being passed to the draw grid function right here once again. Which means it's just one final quick refactor, is that this here will always be a grid config. It's never going to be undefined, so you don't need this here. Doesn't hurt to have it, but not necessary. And then this here will always be present, so there's no need for this either. So I can get rid of that. Okay. And now we are really finished here, just playing around with it a little bit just to make sure everything really is fine before I stop recording and then realize I messed something up. But nope, everything actually does look to be fine and dandy. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this quick tutorial on how to make an HTML canvas drawing interactive by hooking it up to standard HTML input elements. Stay tuned for more, and I will see you later.